So today's video is going to be an in-depth dive into one of America's most nostalgic movies of all time. Today I'm going to tell you the story of the making, or rather the drama of making Dazed and Confused. So sit back, relax, light one up if you so desire, and let's get into the movie. Dazed and Confused, if you didn't know, was written and directed by Richard Linklater. Linklater is a Texan. He was born in Houston, raised in Huntsville, and Huntsville was used as the setting or inspiration for the setting of Dazed and Confused. So you can't really tell the story about Dazed and Confused without telling a little bit about the movie Slacker, because they really go hand in hand. Slacker was Linklater's first feature film. It was an indie art house, very avant-garde film that he financed and made himself in Austin, Texas. So Austin at this time was like a creative hub of like artists and misfits and musicians, and it was also such a cheap place to live. Hence the inspiration behind Slacker, just a bunch of people like trying not to have day jobs, right? Which Linklater described himself at this time in his life as pretty much a slacker. But there was this amazing like art collaborative community in Austin at the time, and Linklater was a part of it, if not the leader in my eyes. So when he was making Slacker, he took basically all of his friends and asked them to help on the crew. He took Austin locals for the actors, or he borrowed Austin locals for the acting. So it was very much a collaborative experience of filmmaking, which if you've worked in films at all, you know is not always the case. But this was Linklater's breakout hit. After he made this movie, which he financed himself, all his hard work paid off. He started submitting to all of the festivals. I think it went to Sundance and went to all the big festivals, and it got a lot of attention. And it got Linklater a lot of attention. He got a write-up in the New York Times, and some big people in Hollywood were starting to pay attention to him. Also a fun note is that Linklater basically paid for Slacker off of his credit card. He spent like $23,000, maybe $25,000, so he was in debt when he made Slacker. But he wound up getting distribution while he was at these film festivals, which helped him pay a little of that off. The producers he caught the attention of were Sean Daniels and Jim Jacks, and they worked for a little production company called Universal Pictures. And more than that, these producers at the time had a reputation for bringing indie filmmakers into the mainstream. By that time, Jim Jacks had worked with the Coen brothers on Raising Arizona. So Jim Jacks approaches Linklater at a film festival and asks him what kind of scripts he's workshopping for his next film. And Linklater says, I want to make American Graffiti, but for the 70s. So right away, this got Jim Jacks' attention. One, he wanted to work with Linklater, and two, he loved American Graffiti. If you've ever seen that movie, it's very much a coming-of-age film. It's kind of, there's not really a plot, I guess. I guess there kind of is more than Dazed and Confused, but it definitely has that feel. So Jacks flies Linklater out to LA, and he wines and dines him. He does the whole Hollywood thing. Puts him up at the Chateau Marmont. I don't even know how to say that because I haven't been there, but if you don't know what that is, it is a very ritzy hotel, kind of like, what is the other one? I cannot think of it off the top of my head. Hollywood Hotel? Oh my God. I'm such a peasant. But the Chateau Marmont is a very popular place for like A-list celebrities, so he put him up there to come pitch his new script idea to the studio. So Linklater goes to give his pitch, right? Jim Jacks is like, oh, I can't wait to hear your pitch. They're at lunch. They're gonna go meet with studio execs after lunch. And Linklater is like, what are they talking about with this pitch? He didn't know that this was kind of the way things rolled. You create a pitch, you pitch it to the studio execs. They either greenlight it or they pass on the project. So Linklater went in without a pitch, but that doesn't mean he went in unprepared. Linklater knew the film he wanted to make. He had a vision, and sometimes I feel like that's all you have to have. You just need to be able to see the movie in your head. And the studio execs went for it. They greenlighted the project. His script went up to the top, which is just unheard of. Usually when you're pitching something and it even gets greenlit, it goes to the bottom of the pile because there's so many other scripts and pitches that were before you. But this got shot up right to the top of the pile, and it was going to go into production very soon, obviously after the script. So for his idea and for creating the script, Linklater was paid $25,000 upfront. And he used that to pay all of his crew and all of the actors and basically pay off his credit card debt from Slacker immediately. So once again, he was kind of broke. So while Universal was initially interested and ready for this idea, they started to grow weary down the road. Once they read the script, they were like, this isn't funny enough. We're scared about the language. We're scared about the kind of rating it's gonna get. Obviously, in their minds, they're thinking of the money side of things. So with that, Jim Jacks and Sean Daniels threatened to take it to another studio, which is kind of weird, I know. These guys work for Universal, wouldn't they just get fired? No, Jim Jacks approached Paramount and they were a competitor for the script. They were like, if Universal doesn't make this, we're gonna make this. Which is kind of a weird play, but it wound up working. And this was a little foreshadowing for Linklater's relationship with Universal Pictures down the road. But that's later on in the video. So if you're coming to this video and you know nothing about film, let me break it down for you a little bit. Film is kind of organized into 3 separate categories. There is a pre-production phase, there's a production phase, and there's a post-production phase. The pre-production is the planning. It's like the crewing up, the casting part, the location scouting, all that jazz, preparing to make the film. So when it came to location, Linklater knew from the get-go that he did not want to make his first studio film in LA. He had a community in Austin. It was where he made his first feature. There was a sense of familiarity, and there was no way that Linklater was going to make this film anywhere else but in Austin. And when I think about this, I can't help but think of a football team playing on their home turf and how there's a sense of familiarity and camaraderie with that, and usually they play better, and I think there was something to that. So Linklater also used a lot of his Slacker crew for his Dazed and Confused crew, and this would actually become a source of conflict in the production process. So casting for Dazed was a very important part of the process. Obviously, this is an ensemble cast, huge casting process. There's so many different roles. So the production team took their time to cast it properly. Linklater partnered with Don Phillips, who casted Fast Times at Ridgemont High and Animal House. He had a knack for discovering young, interesting talent coming up in the acting world, and he was up for the challenge to do it again. So they auditioned in all the acting hubs, Chicago, LA, New York. But Linklater also wanted to have some Austin locals in the mix, so the casting crew handed out flyers all over the streets of Austin, which is how they found Wiley Wiggins, who plays Mitch. He was in a coffee shop, and one of the casting crew people approached him and gave him a flyer because he had long hair, and they were looking for any kids that had a 70s look to them. This is also how they found Catherine Averill Morris, who plays Mitch's love interest, who Wiley Wiggins actually knew. She was a friend of his older sister's, which is kind of funny. Then there was Kristen Hinojosa. I'm gonna butcher her name, I'm so sorry, but she was in school when she got a flyer. Okay, so you're probably wondering how the 2 biggest names in the movie got cast. If you didn't know already, Matthew McConaughey and Renee Zellweger were both in this movie. This was Matthew McConaughey's first film. I don't think it was Renee Zellweger's. I think she had done a few things around Austin at the time, but what's cool to note about this is they were both Austin locals too. Matthew McConaughey at the time had done a beer commercial, and that was it. He was a UT film student and was desperate to break into the film industry somehow. Matthew McConaughey heard through the grapevine that Linklater was crewing up and casting this big feature that he was going to make in Austin in the summer. So he actually wrote Linklater a letter begging to be a PA on set. And if you don't know what a PA is, it is a production assistant, and you're basically bottom of the barrel. You get the coffee, get yelled at. It's that kind of role. And initially, Matthew McConaughey was going to be a PA on Dazed and Confused. Okay, so how did he become the main character of the film? And well, really, that kind of depends on who you ask. Matthew McConaughey likes to tell it as if it was destiny or right time, right place, when in the reality, it was a little bit more manipulated than that. And it goes a little something like this. So one night, Matthew McConaughey is at his frat house, just chilling, hanging out, having a good old time, probably popping a brewski, whatever frat boys do. And he gets a call from one of his friends who's a bartender. The bartender calls him up and he's like, Matthew, You gotta get over here, man. This big casting agent is casting a movie over here, and he's here just chilling by himself. So Matthew McConaughey gets his fine little booty over there and goes and talks to Don Phillips. And to his credit, not a lot of people really have the balls to do that. So Matthew McConaughey goes up and starts talking to him about everything under the sun but Dazed and Confused. In fact, I think they talked about golf the entire time. And keep in mind, this is Matthew, smooth talking, cool, confident, the very definition of Southern charm, McConaughey. And he charmed his way into Don Phillips' heart. So they wound up drinking all night, having a grand old time, and they actually got kicked out of the bar. So Matthew McConaughey goes to Don Phillips' hotel. When it hits Don Phillips, "Hey, Matthew, I have this small little role. It's small, but you could do it. You could audition for it." And just like that, Matthew McConaughey got his golden ticket. Of course, McConaughey had to actually audition for the role of Wooderson, but he went in there with such a swagger that was influenced by his brother, he says. But even then, even though he killed the audition, Linklater was still a little weary about him. But McConaughey assured him that, "I'm not this guy, but I know this guy." So he got the role. Renee Zellweger, on the other hand, kind of came into the mix a little too late. She did really well in her audition, and Linklater really liked her, Don Phillips really liked her, but all the senior girl roles had already been filled, so they made her a featured extra. Before the cast was locked and loaded, Linklater and Don Phillips went back out to LA to bring in all of their people for callbacks, people that they were considering, to really narrow it down. And they were doing this within, I don't know if it was a weekend, I think it might have been one day at the Universal lot. Nearly every rising star auditioned for Dazed and Confused, and I mean everybody. Ashley Judd, Mark Ruffalo, Hilary Swank, Will Wheaton. Brendan Fraser actually passed on the project. Jared Leto auditioned. Claire Danes was up for Sabrina, and Linklater really, really liked her. She was the best actress he'd ever seen before, but she was a little too young. Reese Witherspoon auditioned. Jennifer Love Hewitt, Denise Richards, Vince Vaughn, Alicia Silverstone, and Kirsten Dunst. But sadly, they just didn't make the cut. If you've ever worked in film or TV before, you know that sometimes it feels a lot like summer camp. You're locked into this allotted amount of time with characters you've never met before. There's a hierarchy, it's fun, it's dramatic, it's really hard work, and you're probably going to be so exhausted by the end of it. But also you'll have these long-lasting memories with people that most likely you'll never see again. And a lot of the actors describe their experience with Dazed as being a lot like summer camp. So since we are working with an ensemble cast here, I'm gonna very quickly introduce them so it's easier to keep up. Wiley Wiggins plays Mitch, Catherine Avril Morris plays Julie, Kristen Hinojosa, don't know how to say that last part of her name, plays Sabrina, Joey Lauren Adams, aka Renee Zellweger's doppelganger, plays Simone, Mila Jovovich plays Michelle, Dina Martin DeLucia plays Siobhan, Parker Posey plays Darla, Marissa Ribsey plays Cynthia, Michelle Burke-Thomas plays Jodie, Ben Affleck plays O'Banion, Sean Andrews plays Pigford, Rory Cochrane plays Slater, Adam Goldberg plays Mike, Chrissy Harnos plays Kay, Cole Hausier plays Benny, Sasha Jensen plays Dawn, Jason London plays Pink, Anthony Rapp plays Tony, and Matthew McConaughey, of course, plays Wooderson. Got that? Great. So before they started filming and the New York and LA actors came to Austin, Linklater wrote each of his actors a letter. And within the letter, he told them each to come with something, which means basically coming with something that makes their character distinct. And he also sent them mixtapes of a lot of 70s songs to start to get them into the vibe of the film. So when all the actors did get to Austin, Linklater wanted them all to live together. He put them all up at this hotel called the Crest Hotel, which all of the actors described as the Crust Hotel because it was really grimy. And these actors, who some weren't even in their 20s yet, were kind of left without any supervision. And I think Linklater knew what he was doing by putting his cast together. This is a movie about a bunch of friends partying together and kind of just hanging out. So he wanted all of his actors to be friends, and this is something Olivia Wilde did for Booksmart. She put the two best friends, she made them live together, Beanie Feldstein, and I can't remember the other girl's name off the top of my head, but she made them live together like I think 3 months or so before they started filming, and then they actually became best friends. And I think when you do things like that, it creates this atmosphere that really reads well on screen. So what does a group of hot 20-somethings do with all their time off when they're not filming? Well, they smoked a lot of weed, and with that many pretty people, there was a lot of hooking up. At the time, Marissa Ribsey was dating Jason Lee. Yep, that Jason Lee. So some notable hookups. Shawn Andrews and Mila Jovovich were very into each other. This was kind of like their summer of love, and I'm gonna leave it at that. Ben Affleck supposedly had a thing for a PA named Valerie on set, and he was always trying to ask her out, but she had a boyfriend and was like, ew, go away. So Chrissy and Jason London actually were in a relationship together before they even came out to Austin. They met within the auditioning rooms. Joey Lauren Adams and Rory Cochrane had a thing, but also Rory Cochrane had a thing with Michelle Berg-Thomas. And apparently Michelle had a lot of things with a lot of different guys, and this caused some problems and a rift between the girls. In fact, there was a lot of animosity between the women on set, and that's just kind of a bummer, because I would have liked to see more female friendships in this movie, and you do kind of see it with Parker Posey's character Darla and Joey Lauren Adams' character Simone, and this is kind of because they were real life best friends. They really buddied up during the production. They became fast friends, and they kind of left everybody out. And a lot of the other actors describe them as kind of acting like mean girls sometimes. As far as drama with the men, there wasn't really any, except that everyone almost unanimously hated Shawn Andrews, except for Mila, of course. So Shawn Andrews at this time was supposed to be the breakout star. He had like the most publicity at the time, and you probably have no idea who he is. And during his time on Dazed, he managed to kind of piss off all of the other actors. He would mess up their scenes, he would kind of cause distractions, he would play his music really loud in his honey wagon so it would interrupt other actors. We all know people that are just like very in their own bubble, that they just kind of disregard other people. But things really came to a head when they were filming one scene in the bathroom, and Shawn Andrews is in the kind of the background, and Jason London is talking, and Shawn Andrews during the scene just starts throwing a ball against the wall, and this pissed off Jason London so much. He said it was such a shitty thing to do to another actor, and basically by this he was saying it was his scene and he was basically trying to do anything to get the attention. That's why he was throwing the ball. And so it almost became a fight, like a physical fight on set, and Linklater actually had to step in, and he describes this moment as realizing that these two characters and these two real life guys, like, they're supposed to be playing best friends. Pink and Pickford are actually supposed to be best friends within the film, and these two guys hated each other, and you can't really see that in the movie editing, but there was no way they were going to be able to play that off. And on top of that, Shawn and Mila would always go off on their own. They didn't really join in on any of the fun, so they didn't really have that same camaraderie that all the other people were building. So one of the big themes of talking about the making of Dazed and Confused is the collaborative nature of making it. Linklater really gave the actors so much involvement with their characters. He wanted them to come with something and really helped develop their characters because they were all young people. And Linklater knew that to make a coming-of-age film, he needed the opinions and ideas and thoughts of young people. And this is something that Olivia Wilde also did in Booksmart. Katie Silverman, she's amazing, constantly changed the script because the young people on set were like saying certain things or certain phrases, and they were like, oh, we need this dialogue, you know? Like, they are actually helping us write the movie. But not only that, Linklater also let the actors improv certain lines. He let them pick out their wardrobe. Every single character got to go into the wardrobe department and pick out their wardrobe, which makes you think, why the hell did that guy choose overalls? He let them choose their cars, which is super cool. And another example of the collaborative nature is Parker Posey and Joey Lauren Adams actually wrote their own scene, and they brought it to Linklater. We want to show like a female friendship within this movie because it wasn't really being shown. and we want to shoot this scene. And he said, let's do it. However, while the actors loved this laissez-faire attitude, the crew, not so much. The crew was pretty much split between the LA people and the Austin people, who had very different versions of making a movie. And this caused for tension between the two. The LA crew, well, they were like LA film people, you know? They had a system of movie making. They were from the movie machine of Hollywood, and they were kind of the assembly line workers. They were used to a system and getting things done within a certain amount of time, and Linklater like completely disrupted that and did things his own way, and they weren't used to that. And another thing that caused tension between the LA crew and Linklater specifically was he hired a lot of his friends from Austin that did the Slacker film with him. And specifically, he hired a guy named Lee who was his camera operator for Slacker and had worked with Rick on other projects. And he hired him as a DP from a camera op. And camera operator is a very specified position. You're operating the camera, you're speaking the camera language, whereas DP, you're talking to the grips, you're figuring out the lighting, the framing, the camera, all sorts of other factors that are very important to filmmaking, and you're in charge of it. You're making the calls as the DP. So Lee was obviously severely underqualified for this role, and he made a lot of technical errors during the production of Dazed and Confused that almost got him fired, and that made Jim Jacks really angry with Richard Linklater for even hiring him. So you're probably wondering, okay, then why did Linklater stick with Lee? Why wouldn't he want some superstar DP in the first place? Well, this Linklater's a smart guy, okay? He wanted to make this movie in Austin specifically because he wanted to have more control over his movie and the vision. And sometimes when there's a superstar DP and a director, they can collide sometimes, and sometimes it can become the DP's movie all of a sudden. So what Lee had was loyalty to Rick and a sort of submissiveness to where he would listen to what Linklater wanted and fulfill that. And the two were really close. I mean, they were friends in real life, and they actually had code names for anyone on set that was connected to the studio. Linklater says he was kind of the Mitch of making Dazed and Confused. He was kind of the newbie kid that everyone was like, ugh, who are you? He had everything to prove and everything to lose. And unfortunately, a lot of the crew, and not even just the crew, like the producers, like the studio, were bad-mouthing Rick. And I can't imagine being in such a stressful situation as like your first studio film and you have like all these people writing on you, and to have people lose their confidence in you and like blatantly say stuff like that, like Linklater has to be a really tough individual to not take that to heart. So despite the behind the scenes tension, the actual production of Dazed and Confused started off really smoothly. They went into rehearsals right away when they all came to Austin, and Linklater kind of got things going. At first, Universal wasn't paying as much attention to Dazed and Confused because the same summer they were shooting huge movies like Jurassic Park and Schindler's List. Everything was going great until Jim Jacks came into town. There were a lot of tumultuous relationships on the set of Dazed and Confused, but nothing compares to the tumultuous relationship between the two most powerful men, the producer and the director. Just a few weeks into filming, Linklater sent Jim Jacks a memo complaining about his micromanagement and his presence on set. Jim Jacks would go around set on his telephone because he was producing other movies at the same time of Dazed and Confused, and he was interrupting scenes. There was one point when Jason London was filming his kissing scene with Michelle Burke-Thomas, and he had to yell at Jim Jacks because it was a serious moment, and breaking that up could like break the environment of the scene, you know? You could like blow the vibe. And also Jim Jacks was like hanging out with the kids at the hotel, which is just weird in and of itself. And Jim Jacks didn't really like that Rick didn't understand the studio system yet. He was making Dazed and Confused like how he made Slacker, and he didn't quite understand the machine of Hollywood and that time is money, and money is really all the studio cares about in the end. At the time, I don't think Linklater really understood this yet. He was an indie director. This was his first studio film. He was an independent kind of guy that didn't like authority. And Jim Jacks was kind of like the school principal on set. And there was a lot of fighting over a lot of different things. So at the beginning of the production process, Linklater was doing rehearsals, and I think he had about 3 weeks before they actually started filming, which is not a lot of time in the grand scheme of like how much he had to shoot. So every day before they started filming, he was running rehearsals. So when it came down to actually filming, sometimes they wouldn't actually get any filming done until after lunch, which drove Jim Jacks up a wall. And every single day, it was like Linklater trying to keep certain scenes, and Jim Jacks was like, we have to cut this, we have to cut that because of time. And the way like a union film works is like you only have an allotted amount of time to shoot per day, especially when working with kids. You know, it's a business, it's a union, and you can get in a lot of trouble if you don't stick to the time. In one instance, Jim Jacks really wanted to cut the good game scene. It's like a really brief moment, but Linklater really wanted to keep this in the film because it's such a specific thing. They fought so hard on this that Linklater wound up actually throwing a cup of water at him during the filming process. And this wasn't the only altercation that they would have. At one point, it almost got physical. So Jim Jacks had a lot of problems with all the profanity. He was concerned about the rating of the film because the studio was concerned about it. And when he saw the dailies of Ben Affleck's scene where he gets covered with all that like goo or whatever, he lost it. Because obviously Ben Affleck uses a few words that I cannot use on the tubes, but you probably know what they are. So Jim Jacks goes over to Ben Affleck and is just like, what the... Man, I told you not to say these words and you still said it, which is like, it's not the actor's fault at all. The actor was directed. He went to go find Linklater. He goes over to Linklater's trailer, knocks on the door, and is just like red in the face, so angry, practically like spitting through his words. And Linklater describes this as the moment that he thought they were really going to get into a fight. And he had kind of imagined this moment before, and he kind of strategize as to how he would attack Jim Jacks, because Jim Jacks was a really big dude and he was also like a former wrestler in high school. So Linklater was just gonna come at him just like full force, but luckily it never got that far. Needless to say, Jim Jacks and Richard Linklater were just two complete opposite personalities. Linklater was he's very Austin, you know, like just very chill, like go with the flow, let's see what happens, you know. And Jim Jacks was pretty much stressed out and anxious the entire time of set, as most Hollywood producers are. So tension with Jim Jacks was not the only thing to go wrong during the actual filming of Dazed and Confused. As always happens when filming anything, the only thing you can be certain about is that things will go wrong. For instance, on the day of the hazing scene with the girls, the prop crew didn't have the right tint to match the condiments they were using. So what do? They used real condiments. All the other actors felt so bad for these freshman girls. They spent all day outside on the hot cement with like the Texas summer sun beating down on them, and the condiments literally started to cook on their bodies. One of the girls that was an extra says the smell of ketchup was never the same for her. So when the day shoots started to turn to night shoots, that's when the real fun and troubles started to happen, depending on your position, whether you were the cast or crew. During the filming of the Moon Tower party scene, there was a lot of breaks and long stretches of time to where the actors would need to be in the background, but they weren't necessarily like actually having a scene where they were talking. So what were they doing? A lot of them were smoking weed during these scenes and actually getting drunk. The kegs themselves were full of non-alcoholic beer, which all the actors described as being disgusting, but that didn't stop them from actually getting real beer. Dina Martin DeLucia, her boyfriend was over 21 at the time and supplied them with beers. The crew had a really hard time during the scene because they kept having to wrangle the extras who were also partying along with the actors, and they kept running off into the woods to hook up. The scene where Mitch throws a bowling ball out of the window of the car, Wiley Wiggins was not supposed to actually throw the bowling ball, but he accidentally did. So the reaction that you see in the movie is a real reaction to Wiley accidentally throwing the ball out the window, and Jason London and him are just like, the crew had to run after the bowling ball, and it went through a guy's fence or it was through his garage and wound up in his backyard. But he was cool about it, Austin. And this was not the only time that Wiley Wiggins accidentally caused trouble on set. Actors lie all the time to get certain roles, and Wiley Wiggins just so happened to say that he had played baseball before. And it wasn't until just before they were about to film the baseball pitch throwing scene that Rick realized not only did Wiley Wiggins not ever play baseball, he couldn't even catch a ball from like 3 feet away. So Linklater knew right then that they were going to be in trouble for this scene. Actual little leaguers were used for the extras while Wiley was like struggling to throw that pitch. All the little leaguers were like mocking him and laughing at him from behind the scenes. So they wound up having to bring in a stunt double to actually throw the ball because Wiley he couldn't do it. Okay, we have finally come to the moment you've all been wondering. How did they shoot the paddling scenes? Well, it started off as a piece of fiberglass with a pad on people's butts. But actually, this wasn't working out, and one of the freshman boys that you see getting hit in the film was actually getting hurt and wound up having like all these bruises on him, and his mother wanted to sue the production. So they wound up switching to a metal bar, and that is what they used for Wiley Wiggins' scenes. And the tears that you see in his eyes are actually from crew members like blowing menthol fumes into his eyes. And Linklater describes the paddling scene as just a failure of a stunt. Sometimes there's this thing that happens on set when you have a problem and you have to find a quick solution. And that solution actually winds up being way better than you expected. Well, that's movie magic, baby. And in Dazed and Confused, Matthew McConaughey brought it. Perhaps you know the most famous line in the movie, Matthew McConaughey's, "All right, all right, all right." Did you know it was actually improvised? In fact, the whole scene wasn't initially in the script at all. I realized about halfway through filming Dazed and Confused that he had a hole in the script. He didn't have any way for the nerds, who were Marissa Ribsey, Adam Goldberg, and Anthony Rapp's characters, to find out about the Moon Tower party. His solution? Matthew McConaughey. Keep in mind that Matthew McConaughey was only supposed to be in a few scenes, but he was just that good that they kept writing more for him. So the origin of the scene was actually Marissa Ribsey's idea. She suggested that Wooderson, Matthew McConaughey's character, have a thing for redheads, and that's why they started talking in the first place. So how did he actually come up with the phrase, "all right, all right, all right"? Well, Matthew McConaughey says it was because he was in the car, smoking some weed, listening to Ted Nugent's Strangehold, and the phrase just like came out of him. He just felt it, and so he said it. As soon as he said it, the crew was in shock. They were just like so enthralled with it. They were like, this is the whole vibe for the movie. So as they were writing Matthew McConaughey into the film more, they were kind of writing Shawn Andrews' character out. Shawn Andrews had a lot of creative differences with everyone on set, and even with Linklater himself. Certain scenes, he would be like, "I feel like my character would be over here in the trees, like with my girl." And Linklater's response to this was, "Okay, then you just won't be in the scene at all." So Linklater actually called him up and told him that he thought it would be best if he left early. Most of Dazed and Confused was actually shot sequentially, and Shawn Andrews was actually supposed to be at the very last scene of the movie where they're at the football field. But Shawn Andrews obviously didn't stay, and his absence created more room for Matthew McConaughey, which gave us another really iconic phrase in the film. So during this last scene, Linklater realized he had a problem. He had no climax to the movie. And I know what you're thinking. How can you have a climax when there's not even a plot in the film at all? Well, climax is the wrong word here. Really, he needed a scene that kind of summed up the point of the movie. And that's when Matthew McConaughey improvised yet another iconic line, "You just gotta keep living, man. L-I-V-I-N." And McConaughey said this line was really inspired by him going through what he was going through at the time, which was the passing of his dad, which actually happened during the filming of Dazed. And he said he described this line as super cathartic because he'd been struggling with how to figure out how to kind of process the death of his dad. And it was that moment when he realized, my dad would want me to just keep going. And of course he said it in the most McConaughey way. Since this was pretty much the last scene of the film that they were shooting, like they were about to wrap, and most of the actors actually smoked quite a bit before they started filming it. So pretty much all the actors, when you see them, are pretty stoned. So when it came time to wrap Dazed and Confused, it was really emotional for everyone, especially the actors. And for most, this was their moment to live like the high school or college experience that they'd always wanted. For some, this was the biggest moment of their careers. And for others, this was just a stepping stone. But all of the actors, no matter where they've gone off or what they've done, all look back on the experience with positivity. They all applaud Linklater for his collaborative nature and for making it such a special time. So wrap parties are a tradition. The Dazed and Confused cast and crew had theirs at Lake Travis, which is a big body of water like right outside of Austin, Texas. So after the wrap party, all of the actors were supposed to go to their respective cities, but I think it was probably Matthew McConaughey, but someone suggested that they all go to 6th Street instead. So instead of flying out, they all canceled their flights and rebooked them for the next day and went out to 6th Street, got drunk. They all slept on the floor of Matthew McConaughey's like frat house. And I think that just goes to show they were having the time of their lives and they didn't want it to end. So while this was the end of the Dazed and Confused experience for the on-set crew and the cast, it wasn't over yet for Richard Linklater. In fact, he had a huge uphill battle ahead of him. So before I go into the post-production phase of Dazed and Confused, I just want to mention that Linklater found out he was going to be a dad during this process. I can't imagine juggling everything with his personal and professional life all at the same time. So right away, Universal had problems with the first cut. And the first cut was actually, I think, a little over 3 hours in length. So the studio and the producers thought it should be re-edited to be more of a comedy. They wanted faster cuts, less monologues, and overall just like a faster pace of a film. But what makes Dazed and Confused so special is kind of this like laziness style to the shots. They're long, they're drawn out, and I think that plays to not only the time period, like the 70s, but also the time period in which we're portraying, which is the lives of teenagers. And there is like a lazy freedom about having that much time. It's like all you have is time, but you don't know what to do with it yet. But ultimately, Linklater did come around and cut some of the monologues. So there's actually a ton of scenes that didn't make the cut, and I'm gonna leave a link down at the bottom below, and let me know if you think certain scenes should have been kept. One personally that I watched that I really wish Linklater would have kept was the scene of the girls in the bathroom, and they're kind of talking about life, and they talk a little bit about boys, but like we actually get to hear them talk about like real life stuff and like the future, and the girls are just kind of in the background a little bit, you know, and that's kind of a bummer. This is really where we hear Chrissy speak. We don't really see her very much, but I think she would have added so much to the film if we got to hear her scenes, because she was so, I don't know, like her scene was very eloquent. I just wish they would have portrayed female friendships more in the movie. Also watch Joey and Parker Posey's scene on the car where they're just sitting and talking about their moms, because that's the scene that they actually wrote for their characters. And let me know if you think that should have been kept in or if you think Linklater was right to cut it. So Linklater's editor was Sandra Adair, and she kind of, you know, took Linklater's side for most of the editing. And I think she works with him to this day on his films. So after the first cut, obviously Universal wasn't happy, so they made Linklater and like all of his editing crew go to California on the Universal lot to finish editing the film. And not only that, they made them edit in this like dilapidated building, and they gave Linklater like this shitty ass car to drive around and made him stay in like a crappy apartment. And they were kind of taking out the frustrations that they had with Dazed and Confused on Linklater, and they were taking this opportunity to do it. So I don't think I've mentioned this yet, but the budget for Dazed and Confused was $6.9 million. In terms of the film industry, it's quite a small budget. 1/6 of the budget was spent on music. But I mean, would Dazed and Confused really be as good as it is without Aerosmith's Sweet Emotion as the intro? So when it came time to choose the soundtrack, it was a full-on war. The studio wanted to cut the budget for the music. They wanted to be able to control which bands were going to be included in the film. But Linklater knew that changing the music would destroy the very essence of the film. So as a solution, the studio wanted to hire this band named Jackal, and they wanted them to do a cover of a modern song. and Linklater was not having it. And they were going to pay them like a good amount of money to put towards the music budget to include this song in like the second half of the credits. Okay, nobody's gonna see that, but Linklater still refused. He begged and he pleaded and he faxed so many people, but no one was listening to Linklater at that point. The studio was basically making decisions without him, and he knew the only thing he could do was write the band a letter. So he sent a personal letter to the band explaining his worries and just saying that this was going to hurt his film. So Jackal actually dropped out of the deal, and the studio and Jim Jackson, Sean Daniels were pissed. So now how are they going to pay for this expensive soundtrack? Well, at one point the studio said Linklater should pay for it himself. Ultimately, the producers wound up paying for it, and I think even though they kind of are the bad guys a little bit in this narrative of telling of Dazed and Confused, we have to give them mad props here, because Dazed and Confused would not be Dazed and Confused without the soundtrack. After the editing phase is over, what a studio will do is they'll take this movie and they'll show it to certain demographics to kind of test it, kind of like a focus group. And they'll ask these groups questions after they watch the movie, like, did you understand the movie? Did you like the plot? Was it funny? Did you like these characters? Yada, yada, yada. Stuff like that. And Ben Affleck is back in LA, and he actually got a flyer to go see Dazed and Confused, but he didn't realize that it was Dazed yet. He was like, oh, what's this movie for? Because this guy was trying to get him to be in the focus group, and he was like, it's a dumb movie. Nobody wants to watch it. Nobody's in it. And when he found out it was Dazed and Confused, it was such a bummer for Ben Affleck, because he thought it was going to be like a big movie. So when it came time for the business part of the movie making process, which is always like marketing strategy, it was basically like, how can we make this a stoner film? So the studio makes a poster for the film that included the smiley face, which Linklater had problems with, of course, because it wasn't authentic to the time period. Linklater was so specific about what to include and what not to include in the film, and Linklater even went so far as to hire his own poster designer, who made a pretty epic poster. So when it comes time to actually release Dazed and Confused to the masses, Universal decides that it does not want Dazed and Confused under the studio name. They lacked confidence in the movie, and so they were going to release it under their sister production company called Gramercy Pictures, and they were going to release it as a specialty film. And Linklater was really upset by this, because he was going to get a much smaller release for having worked with the studio and done the crappy parts of working with the studio. He wasn't going to benefit from working with the studio, which is always the release, because it's going to be out to more people. It'll be distributed wider than it would have been as an indie. So he basically made a studio film to be distributed as an indie film. But by this point, this decision was completely out of Linklater's hands. So the movie finally releases under Gramercy Pictures and doesn't do too well by studio standards. Opening weekend, Dazed and Confused grossed about, I think, just under $1 million, and then it would go on to make just above or just under $8 million. And Linklater was just hurt. This movie was his baby, and he blamed the studio and the marketing and the distribution of it for its, I don't even want to say a failure, but like he had expectations for Dazed that was impossible because of the distribution of it. And he wanted to explain that to his actors, so he wrote them a letter just kind of explaining the politics and the marketing decisions and how it was kind of out of his hands at that point. So then how did Dazed become so iconic? Well, that's all thanks to DVD and VHS at the time. Remember Blockbusters? It was also a movie that spread from word of mouth. There's an interview where Kevin Smith is talking about how you would want to rent Dazed and Confused, but it was always checked out. And Dazed started to become something of a cult classic, kind of similar to Rocky Horror Picture Show. Now it lives on to be streamed, and every year more young people are finding it and watching it. And although Dazed got like a small release, it got a lot of really good reviews, and one film critic described it as the shit-faced American Graffiti. So now you're probably wondering, okay, What became of the actors after Dazed and Confused? Well, we all know what happened to certain ones. Ben Affleck, Adam Goldberg, Matthew McConaughey, Renee Zellweger. They went on to be themselves and have these amazing careers. So Wiley Wiggins and Kristen Hinojosa, they were Austin locals, and they got a little taste of acting in like the film industry, and of course they wanted to continue that. So they actually wound up graduating early, and they didn't do this together, by the way. They wound up graduating early and going out to LA to pursue acting. But unfortunately for them, this Dazed and Confused was their first film, and majority of films are not like that. Acting and auditioning in the film industry is a grind, and it's not for everyone. And Kristen Hinojosa, she found this out pretty early on and decided that her mission in life wasn't acting at all. It was actually to do social service, and that's what she does to this day. Wiley Wiggins, however, did some acting and is still in California. He actually wound up founding a international gaming festival called Fantastic Arcade. He's currently studying at UCLA right now. So majority of the actors went back to LA, and a lot of them continue to act to this day. Parker Posey, Joey Lauren Adams, Jason London, Cole Hauser. So what happened to Shawn Andrews and Mila Jovovich after the filming of Dazed and Confused wrapped? Well, they actually wound up getting hitched. They wound up getting married, but Mila's mother had it annulled shortly after because I think she was 16 or 17 at the time, way too young to be getting married. But of course, as we know, Mila would go on to star in Fifth Element and the Resident Evil franchise, and is still a pretty big name to this day, and continues to act. And actually something that I thought was super interesting that a lot of people I don't think know about her is she made an album shortly after the release of Dazed and Confused, and I think it came out in 1993. It's called The Divine Comedy. It's on Spotify if you want to hear it, but she has such an interesting voice, and she wrote all of her songs too. So immediately after Dazed and Confused, she went on this van tour, like touring her music all over America. So as we all know, Dazed and Confused is largely based off of Linklater's life in high school. And like most artists, he used a lot of his life for creative inspiration. And he used a lot of his life as a creative inspiration down to the names of the characters. Names Wooderson, Slater, and Richard Pink Floyd actually were people that Linklater knew in high school. Maybe he didn't know them too well, but he borrowed their names, and these guys were not that happy about it. These guys wound up suing Linklater for emotional distress and like negligence, defamation, and negligent infliction of emotional distress. One guy said it was impacting his personal life and his business, and therefore his money. And one of the other guys to this day admits that he was just doing it to try to get some money out of it. These guys became the Dazed Three, and a lot of people were just making fun of them, like they just wanted their 15 minutes of fame, and there's actually an SNL skit about them. And this doesn't really have anything to do with Dazed, but I really wanted to mention it, that Dazed and Confused is one of Quentin Tarantino's favorite movies. It's like in his top 10 favorite movies of all time, and I really see the inspiration that Quentin Tarantino had for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, because if you've seen that movie, it's kind of a day in the life of those characters. And Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, although it has an ending point, like there's not really a plot to it. I don't know. I think it's just really cool when you see those parallels, and I think he was like inspired by Linklater, whether he was conscious of it or not. So there was actually almost a sequel to Dazed, and it got passed around to all the actors, or the idea of it, and everyone was really excited about it, but ultimately it just didn't happen. Maybe it was funding, I'm not really sure what happened there. Linklater wound up doing somewhat of a sequel, but it took place in the 80s, and I think it's called Everybody Wants Some. And it was actually filmed on my college campus while I was going to school there. And I didn't know that it was Linklater's film, but I was supposed to be an extra in that movie. In fact, I was supposed to be in the disco dancing scene, and I spent a whole day with my best friend. Like, they taught us how to like disco dance and like make it sexual or whatever. Really, we wound up just dancing with really sweaty men. And had I known that it was a Richard Linklater movie, I definitely would have done it, but I skipped it to go to my math test, which makes me sound like an L7 weenie. And that's the story of Dazed and Confused. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope if you know nothing about the film industry, maybe you learned something. And before I go, I just wanted to say if you really love Dazed and Confused and you want to do a deeper dive, I really recommend getting this book. It is so amazing. It's called The Oral History of Richard Linklater's Dazed and Confused. It goes into like such specifics that like I just don't have the time to go into. But like there's so much that I didn't cover that is in this book. That being said, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It took me a really long time to do this and to research everything, but I so enjoyed doing it. So let me know if you did enjoy it, if you like videos like this. Leave a comment on which movie you would like me to do a deep dive into next.